So, just to get an idea of how this does look in other jurisdictions, I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Cameron Herrington. He's with the Northeast neighborhoods, or neighbors rather, for housing affordability, and overall, is a really smart person. So here you go.
Oh, thanks, Vivian. Thanks to Southeast Uplift and particularly Katie Asher for all the work organizing this event in the back. So I am going to discuss two specific cases of other jurisdictions around the country that use inclusionary zoning as a way to create permanently affordable housing. But first I want to frame how I've come to think about this tool in the context of our housing market. And that's to say that there are really two different approaches we can take to making housing affordable for folks who have lower incomes and who are disadvantaged in the market. The first is that we could raise everyone's income so they can afford the rents and the housing costs that we have. So all we have to do for that is completely restructure the entire economy. Overthrowing capitalism would probably be helpful. We have to kick out all of the major speculative investors that are flooding the market. There was a big article last week in the Portland Tribune saying that Portland is now the #2 city in the United States where institutional investors are buying up housing, flipping housing with no regulation on that activity. So if we do all of those things, then the $15 minimum wage, that's not going to get it done. We're probably going to have like a $50 minimum wage or something. So as soon as we do all of that, then everyone can afford housing and we won't have to worry about IZ. That is probably not realistic in the near term. And so the second path, which I think is more promising and is actually in practice in places around the country, is in practice in pockets, even in Portland, and is in practice at huge scales in other countries, is to decommodify as much housing as possible. So that means taking housing off of the market so that it doesn't go to people based on how much money they have and how much income they have, but that housing is treated as a human right. So, for example, in the Netherlands, 40% of the housing in the entire country is what is called social housing. It's owned by the government, and people access it on the basis of being humans and needing a place to live, rather than on the basis of being able to outcompete their neighbors and driving up the costs for everyone. So that's where I think inclusionary zoning is a really powerful tool. It's a tool to remove housing from the speculative market, to make it available for people on some basis other than how much income they have. And once we have an egalitarian society where we don't have differences in income, then I'll drop this. But until then, let's make housing a human right, like Vivian said. So there's kind of this contradiction around housing, because if we think of it as a right, it's hard for it also to be this speculative commodity. The market for housing is really different than the market for other things, because the value of a house and of property goes up over time. It's kind of like something like fine arts or jewels, where you buy it because you know that you can sell it for more later. Whereas if you buy a car, you buy it knowing that you're going to sell it for a lot less later. And if you buy a house and it gets run down in a neighborhood with a hot housing market, it's still worth more than it was when you bought it, because there's profit being made by tearing it down and building something worth even more. So we can't really get stuck thinking about housing affordability as a supply and demand issue. Thinking if we just build more, then that will increase supply and that will balance out the demand. That's not how housing works. It's not like toasters or TVs or cars. It's something completely different. So IZ, feel free to say. IZ is one tool that can create housing that's not part of this system. And that's why I think it's important. So two examples of places that have used IZ as a tool to create permanently affordable housing. One is Montgomery County, Maryland, and that was the first jurisdiction that instituted inclusionary zoning in 1974. So this is a suburb of Washington, D.C., a very wealthy suburb. And since 1974, they have produced over 13,000 units of housing, or to, I think Vivian's right, homes, not units of housing. It's not just a widget, it's a place where actual people live and build their lives. 13,000 homes have been created that are not part of this market system, where people can access it based to a greater extent on their need for a place to live and raise their families. So this has created mixed income communities where lower income families can access the best schools in that area. They have access to other services, transportation options that don't exist in places where housing is cheap on the market. And the reason why housing is cheap in certain places is because people with more resources don't want to live there. So we have, as Vivian said, we have a lot of kind of unintentionally affordable housing, which can otherwise be thought of as that it's kind of affordable by matter of circumstance. What inclusionary zoning does is it creates housing that is intentionally affordable permanently, regardless of the circumstances that exist in the market, from month to month or year to year. So Montgomery County, Maryland, over 13,000 units in less than 30 years. And that is using no direct government subsidy. That is just using the market to create housing that is regulated and made affordable for lower income families. That's another important part about inclusionary zoning. It doesn't require ongoing subsidy for families to kind of meet the gap between what they can afford to pay and the rent. Another important example is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So there's an important similarity between North Carolina and Oregon when it comes to our housing policies. Both states have statewide bans on rent control, both Oregon and North Carolina. So Oregon also, of course, right now has the statewide ban on inclusionary zoning. Rent control is a different policy that is also banned in Oregon. So there's a lot of concern about if and when, not if, when, later this year, we can use inclusionary zoning in Oregon. Will the state's rent control ban get in the way of us implementing effective local policies to create affordable housing? The good news from North Carolina is that they have already faced that same situation, where inclusionary zoning is allowed, but rent control is not. And so the way that they have kind of navigated that situation is by having their local inclusionary zoning policies create affordable home ownership opportunities through what's called a community land trust. So Portland actually has a community land trust. It's called Proud Ground. And this is an organization that owns land and takes land off of the speculative housing market. And then families own that house, the structure that sits on top of that land. Because Proud Ground, the land trust, owns the land, it regulates how much that house can be sold for. So with one initial subsidy for the first buyer of that house, the resale price is regulated forever. So it's one upfront subsidy that keeps that house affordable, and that subsidy gets passed on for each subsequent owner of the house. So in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, this is how they structure their inclusionary zoning. That whenever a developer builds a development that is going to include 5 or more units of housing that will be owned, that includes single-family housing subdivisions, it includes townhomes, it includes condo buildings where someone is actually buying the unit rather than renting. Whenever there's a building with 5 or more units, it's mandatory that 20% of those units be placed into the community land trust. That's something that we can do here in Portland later this year after the legislature finishes its job. So in Chapel Hill, the homes that are part of the land trust are selling for usually about half of the market price. And that again is because of the inclusionary zoning law that exists in that city. So that is, I think, a very promising example of how we could use this new tool here in Oregon, in Portland, and then after we get through the next fight of eliminating the rent control ban, that'll probably happen, next summer or so? Then we'll have a whole slew of other options for how we use inclusionary zoning. So I've been thinking about what are we missing out on here in Portland? What have we been missing out on here in Portland in terms of affordable housing? Because we don't have this robust suite of tools that exist in almost everywhere else in the country. So, with the help of a couple of other really smart folks through Southeast Uplift and help from the city's Bureau of Planning, we started to put some numbers to this. So, the city's identified an area for planning purposes that they call the Belmont Hawthorne Division Town Center. And that is a circle that is roughly encompasses from about 25th to 40th Avenue southeast, from Clinton Street on the south to Belmont on the north. And between 2005 and 2014, there were 582 new units of housing that went into just that area. 0 of those 582 units have any sort of affordability restriction or regulation. Those are all market rate and all completely unaffordable to lower income households. If we had effective inclusionary zoning policies here in Portland that have been in place for that decade, as they have in 500 other jurisdictions, and if we had set a modest policy of a 20% affordable set aside, that would have created, just those market rate developments would have created 116 units of housing that would be affordable to households that right now have no chance to afford housing in that area. So that's right here in Southeast Portland. The part of town where I live and where I am involved in affordable housing advocacy in inner north and northeast Portland, we're all continuously shocked by the new development going up on North Vancouver and Williams Avenues. So just between, in that Vancouver-Williams corridor, between Fargo Street and Skidmore, which is probably about a dozen blocks, over the last 5 years, new housing that has either been built or is currently under construction amounts to 1,200 units. Of those 1,200, the good news is there are some that are income restricted. 16. Those are regulated through a city program called Multi, through which the developer gets financial incentives from the city to add these 16 units, which will be held affordable below market rate for a period of 10 years, at which point they will revert to market rate. So that's, maybe we'll count each of those as like half of a unit then, since they go back to the market in 10 years. So let's say out of 1,200 units, we get 8 affordable units. Whereas if we had a 20% inclusionary zoning affordable set aside, of those 1,200 units, we would have 240 that were affordable to lower income households. So inclusionary zoning is a tool that works best in hot real estate markets, hot housing markets. Portland is the poster child of where inclusionary zoning would be working best, and we can't do it. Which is why we need this tool, and many others. But we need this tool, and we need it right now, and we need the Senate to pass this bill right now to let us use this tool. And after that, then we're going to be organizing all of you to get down to City Hall and make sure that we implement the strongest possible version of inclusionary zoning in Portland, because getting rid of the state ban is only the first step. The home builders are fighting it there, and we know that once the ban is lifted, they're going to come here and to try to water down any attempt to implement inclusionary zoning locally. And that's where we're going to need to exercise our local power. Right now, basically our entire legislative delegation from the Portland area supports the bill to repeal the ban. So what we can do at the state level is talk to our friends and relatives throughout the state, make sure that they're telling their senators to support this bill. But our real time to shine comes after the ban is lifted, and we have then the challenge to create the strongest possible ordinance here locally. So that tool will be a great first step to a movement for affordable housing here in Portland, for removing housing from the market so that it's accessible to people not based on their income and not based on their wealth, not based on their race, because we know that that is strongly determinant of access to housing and of income and wealth. But this is an important first step toward shifting how we think about housing in this